"You don't belong here." The words weren't spoken aloud, but they pulsed in the air like a poison, unspoken yet unmistakable. The restaurant was the kind of place where silence was served with the same precision as the wine, where polished crystal chandeliers glowed like captive stars, and every plate was a work of art. Waiters glided across the floor with rehearsed grace, and laughter from well-dressed patrons floated in the air like smoke rings, soft, controlled, delicate. This was a sanctuary for the powerful, the wealthy, the untouchable. But tonight their sanctuary was about to be shattered. It began with a sound, not the clink of cutlery, not the pop of a champagne cork, but a scream, raw, sharp, unfiltered. It tore through the velvet calm of the room like glass breaking on marble. Heads turned, forks froze mid-air. The music from the piano faltered for just a heartbeat, as though even the keys had been startled. And at the center of it all, a boy sat clutching his ears, his small frame rocking, his face twisted in agony that no one in the room could truly understand. His father, a man whose name was whispered with reverence in boardrooms and financial circles, sat frozen beside him. His tailored suit fit like armor, his wristwatch worth more than most cars in the parking lot. But here, in this moment, he looked like every other parent in the world, helpless, frightened, desperate. He reached for his son, whispering something only the boy could hear, but the cries only grew louder. Around them, discontent stirred. A woman in pearls leaned toward her husband, her lips curling in disapproval. A businessman shifted uncomfortably, his voice low and sharp. Can't he control his kid? Another patron raised an eyebrow, as if the very idea of imperfection in this temple of perfection was offensive. The stares multiplied, heavy as stones, invisible yet crushing, and still the boy screamed. This was not just a sound. This was a plea for understanding, a voice no one seemed willing to hear. It echoed against the gilded walls, against the polished marble floor, against the hollow hearts of those who believed money could buy peace. In a room built for control and order, chaos had arrived in the form of a child. The father's hand trembled as he tried again to comfort him, but doubt gnawed at his eyes. Doubt and shame. He could weather hostile takeovers and financial storms, but here, under the judgmental gaze of strangers, he was losing a battle he couldn't fight with numbers or contracts. And somewhere across the room, a waitress paused. Her tray of sparkling glasses tilted slightly as her gaze settled on the boy. She heard what others dismissed as noise. She saw what others ignored. The storm was not just disrupting service. It was breaking hearts, though most of them were too hardened to notice. Stay with me, because what happened next would change everything. The man everyone in that room recognized was Arthur Langston, a billionaire whose name appeared in headlines, whose face graced magazine covers, and whose empire stretched across industries most people could barely comprehend. Outwardly, he was power personified. He had built walls of glass and steel, commanded boardrooms with the flick of a pen, and made choices that rippled across nations. Yet beneath that exterior, beneath the practiced calm and the perfectly pressed suits, was something far more fragile. His son was the one place where wealth became meaningless, where no amount of money could silence the screaming or ease the storms inside the boy's mind. Behind the empire and the empire's glow, Arthur was just a father, lonely in ways no one could measure, isolated by a battle invisible to the world. Arthur loved his son with the kind of devotion money couldn't buy, but it was a love lined with fear. He feared judgment. He feared that others would never understand. He feared that every public outing was an invitation for whispers, for cruelty, for humiliation. At home, behind closed doors, he would lie awake at night listening to his boy breathe, wondering if he was doing enough, if love could ever be enough. He had conquered markets, but he could not conquer the silence of his own doubts. The boy's name was Ethan, 10 years old, with eyes the color of a storm about to break. To the world, he was Arthur Langston's son. To himself, he was simply Ethan, a child who lived in a world louder and sharper than most could imagine. Lights burned too bright. Sounds crashed like thunder. Even the texture of fabric could feel like fire against his skin. A simple restaurant was not simple at all. It was a battlefield of clattering plates, murmuring voices, sudden bursts of laughter that hit like explosions. Ethan did not scream to disturb. He screamed because his body was overwhelmed, because his brain could not quiet the flood. Yet behind those screams lived a boy of remarkable tenderness. He could spend hours tracing the curve of a seashell, watching how light played across its ridges. He found joy in repetition, in the comfort of patterns others dismissed as meaningless. He was not broken, he was different. But difference in a world obsessed with normal too often looked like a flaw. His father saw him. He saw the quiet brilliance, the fierce innocence, the beauty of a mind that noticed things others overlooked. But the world rarely saw what Arthur saw. The world only noticed when Ethan screamed. And in rooms like this, where power and money dictated what was acceptable, those screams felt like rebellion. And then there was her. Claire. The waitress with tired eyes that carried both exhaustion and fire. She did not belong to the world of chandeliers and imported wine. She belonged to the world of overdue bills, of double shifts, of shoes worn thin by endless hours on her feet. Her uniform was clean but fraying at the seams, a reflection of her life, presentable on the outside but stretched thin beneath. Claire had seen her share of cruelty. Life had not spared her. There were scars she carried that no one in that room would ever guess. Scars born from broken promises and long nights of trying to be stronger than she felt. Yet she kept moving. She kept smiling, because that was the armor she had learned to wear. People ordered, complained, tipped poorly, and left. She served, endured, survived. That was her rhythm. That was her battle. But within her lived something unshakable, compassion. A kind of quiet resilience that wealth could not purchase. She knew what it was to feel small, to feel unseen, to be judged without mercy. And so when her eyes fell upon Ethan's trembling hands and the father's silent plea, something stirred in her that went beyond duty. It was not about service anymore. It was about humanity. The contrast could not have been sharper. Arthur, the man who had everything yet sat powerless before his child. Ethan, the boy misunderstood by a room that prized perfection over truth. And Claire, the woman with nothing to spare, yet carrying a wealth invisible to all but the few who dared to look closer. Wealth versus work, privilege versus empathy, a billionaire's world colliding with the quiet dignity of a waitress. This was no longer just a dinner. It was the weaving together of lives from opposite ends of the human spectrum. And it would be in this intersection, of power and vulnerability, of judgment and compassion, that something extraordinary would unfold. The scream did not stop. It rose and fell like a siren, filling every corner of the restaurant until even the chandeliers seemed to tremble. Ethan rocked in his chair, fists pressed against his ears, his small frame convulsing with the weight of sounds too heavy for him to bear. The polished calm of the evening had shattered, and in its place was a chaos that no one in the room knew how to handle. Whispers erupted first. Subtle, poisonous, like snakes hissing in the grass. Some people shouldn't bring kids like that out in public. A woman muttered behind her napkin, her diamond necklace glittering as if to punctuate her cruelty. Across the room, a man in an expensive suit leaned toward his companion. "This is ridiculous. We're paying for an experience, not a daycare." Their words were quiet, but in a room like this, whispers carried, and each one cut deeper than they realized. They didn't see Ethan's pain. They saw only inconvenience. They didn't hear his plea. They heard only disruption. Arthur Langston sat rigid beside his son, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as if it might break. His hand hovered uncertainly over Ethan's back, desperate to soothe, terrified to worsen the storm. He whispered his son's name again and again, soft, pleading, almost like a prayer. "Ethan, Ethan, it's okay. You're safe. You're safe, son." But Ethan's screams only grew louder, sharp cries that pierced through the room like arrows. Arthur could feel the stares drilling into him, each one a silent accusation. For a man who had mastered every room he entered, who could silence entire boards with a single raised eyebrow, there was nothing more devastating than the helplessness of this moment. His mind battled itself. Pride told him to stand tall, to shield his son from their judgment, to pretend he didn't hear their whispers. Shame whispered back, cruel and merciless, telling him he had failed, that he was exposing his boy to ridicule, that he was too weak to protect him. And beneath it all, love surged like a tidal wave, overwhelming, unrelenting. Love that made him want to pick Ethan up and run far away, to a place where chandeliers didn't glare and strangers didn't sneer. But running would only feed their cruelty. Running would only prove them right. At another table, an older woman shook her head with theatrical dismay. "Poor parenting," she murmured, just loud enough for Arthur to hear. Her companion chuckled bitterly, adding, "Money can buy a lot of things. Clearly not manners." Arthur's chest burned. He wanted to shout, to tell them that his son was not a problem to be solved, not a spectacle to be mocked. He wanted to scream louder than Ethan, to drown out their venom. But he said nothing. His silence was its own prison. Meanwhile, the staff shifted uneasily. Waiters exchanged nervous glances as complaints trickled in. A couple demanded to be moved to a quieter table. Another guest flagged down the maitre d', insisting, "This is unacceptable. Do something." The restaurant's reputation was at stake, and reputations in places like this were worth more than truth. Claire stood frozen near the bar, her tray balanced but forgotten. She could feel the tension thickening the air like smoke. Every complaint funneled toward the staff, but the weight of the moment pressed directly onto her shoulders. She had seen difficult guests before. She had endured drunks, entitled millionaires, even screaming children. But this was different. This was not a tantrum. It was a storm inside a child who couldn't control it, and the storm was pushing against walls too fragile to hold it. The maitre d' approached Arthur, his steps hesitant, his professional smile stretched tight. He bent slightly, his voice low, almost apologetic, but edged with urgency. "Sir, perhaps it would be better if—" Arthur's head snapped up, his eyes flashing like steel. "If what?" he demanded, his voice low but dangerous. The maitre d' hesitated. "If you considered stepping outside, just for a few moments, to calm him down." It was phrased politely, but the meaning was clear. "Take your boy away. Remove the problem. Hide what doesn't fit." Arthur's breath caught in his throat. His son was not a problem. His son was his life. Yet in that instant, every whisper, every stare, every judgment coiled around him, squeezing the air from his chest. He felt small, stripped of the armor his wealth usually provided. He could buy out the entire restaurant. He could silence every critic with a single phone call. And yet here, with his son trembling and screaming beside him, he was powerless. Ethan's cries grew more desperate, his rocking more violent. The piano player had stopped altogether now, his hands frozen above the keys, unsure whether to continue or to wait. The silence between the screams was filled with tension, with judgment, with 100 hearts closing themselves off, and then came the breaking point. A man in a corner booth, his voice louder than a whisper now, snapped. "This is outrageous. Why should the rest of us suffer because one child can't behave?" His words struck the air like a gavel, harsh and final. Heads nodded. Murmurs of agreement rippled across the room. Arthur's heart sank. His son was no longer just a boy in pain. He had become a spectacle, a disruption, a scapegoat for the impatience of strangers. Claire's chest tightened as she watched it unfold. She could see Arthur's face, flushed, strained, close to breaking. She could see Ethan's small hands trembling, his body folding inward as though he wanted to disappear but couldn't. And she could see the other diners, their faces twisted with judgment, their humanity buried beneath the weight of entitlement. This was not just a dinner anymore. This was about dignity, about whether compassion could survive in a room where perfection was prized above kindness, about whether one child's pain would be silenced or heard. Claire's hands tightened around her tray. She knew the rules. Her duty was to serve, to smile, to keep the guests comfortable. The wealthy had paid for an experience, and she was part of delivering it. But what about this boy? What about the father fighting silently against a tide of cruelty? What about the truth that was unfolding before her eyes? Each second stretched like an eternity. Ethan's screams rose again. Arthur's hand trembled against his son's shoulder, and the whispers circled like vultures. The maitre d' shifted nervously nearby, waiting for the father to concede, to take his boy outside and restore the illusion of peace. Claire knew a decision was coming. Not from Arthur. Not from the maitre d'. From herself. Her heart pounded as she looked around the room. To the other guests, Ethan was a disturbance to be removed. To the staff, he was a problem to be managed. But to her, he was something else entirely. A child crying out for help. Their father drowning in silence, and so caught between duty and compassion, between the complaints of the wealthy and the cries of the powerless. Claire felt the weight of a choice pressing down on her, This was no longer about food being served. This was about hearts being tested, and the test was far from over. Claire's palms were damp against the tray, though she wasn't carrying a thing anymore. The complaints still buzzed around her like hornets, the maître d' hovering nervously, the guests waiting for someone to enforce order. All eyes seemed to flicker between Arthur and Ethan, then to her as if she were the one expected to restore the balance. And maybe she was. After all, she was the waitress, the servant, the one paid to make their night seamless, comfortable, forgettable. But in that moment, Claire knew she couldn't play her role. She couldn't let this boy's pain be hidden away like something shameful. She couldn't pretend not to see. Her breath steadied, her pulse slowed, and a quiet resolve settled in her bones. She set the tray aside, smoothed the front of her uniform, and walked toward the table where Arthur sat with his trembling son. The room seemed to inhale with her steps, every sound fading except for Ethan's desperate cries. The click of her shoes on the marble floor echoed like a drumbeat, drawing every gaze, commanding attention she had never once sought. Arthur lifted his head, startled, wary. His eyes that had stared down rivals that had won battles over billions, now carried something raw and broken. He looked at her as though expecting another demand, another suggestion to leave, another reminder of how unwanted they were in this world of chandeliers and whispered cruelty. But Claire did not speak at first. She knelt down, not beside Arthur, beside Ethan, lowering herself until she was at his level, eye to eye, ground to ground. The room gasped softly, a ripple of disbelief. Waitresses did not kneel in front of billionaires' children. They refilled glasses, cleared plates, disappeared into the background. Yet here she was, folding herself small in a room designed to make her invisible, making herself seen in the only way that mattered. Ethan's fists pressed harder against his ears. His body rocked violently, his breathing ragged. Claire didn't reach for him. She didn't try to touch. She simply sat there, her knees pressing against the marble, and whispered almost too softly to hear. "It's loud, isn't it?" Arthur froze. His lips parted, confusion flickering across his face. No one had said that before. No one had spoken to his son like that, as though acknowledging his storm instead of denying it. Claire's voice was calm, steady, like the rhythm of a tide. "It hurts. Too many sounds all at once. Too bright, too sharp." For a moment Ethan's rocking slowed. His cries were still high, still raw, but his head tilted slightly, his eyes darting toward her through tears. Someone had named the chaos he was trapped inside. Someone understood. Claire smiled gently, a softness that held no pity, only recognition. She reached slowly for her apron pocket and pulled out a small folded napkin. From inside it, she revealed something simple, a tiny wooden keychain shaped like a bird. It was worn, the paint chipped, the kind of thing worth no money at all, yet priceless in its story. "I keep this with me," she whispered, holding it out where Ethan could see, but not forcing it into his hands. "Whenever things get too heavy, I look at it. It reminds me I'm safe, that I'm not alone." "Do you want to see?" The boy's sobs hitched. His rocking slowed again. His small trembling hands lowered just enough to peek at the object in her palm. A bird, gentle, simple, familiar. His gaze fixed on it, his chest rising and falling in shorter, less desperate bursts. Arthur's throat tightened. He watched as his son, who moments ago had been unreachable, inconsolable, began to shift. Slowly, cautiously, Ethan reached out. His fingers brushed the edge of the wooden bird, then closed around it. Silence. It wasn't perfect silence. The restaurant still hummed with life. The whispers still buzzed at the edges, but within Ethan a silence was forming. His cries softened into whimpers, his rocking slowed into stillness. His eyes, glassy with tears, now glowed with a fragile kind of peace. And the room, every patron, every critic, every judge, sat frozen. They had expected the waitress to scold, to demand, to escort. Instead, she had done something they could not comprehend. She had offered empathy, and empathy had done what money and power could not. Arthur felt the sting of tears burning behind his eyes. He had held boardrooms hostage with his authority, but this moment, this act of quiet humanity undid him. He had never wept in public. Not once, not even when markets crashed or rivals betrayed him. But now, as he watched his son cradle that tiny bird and breathe more evenly, his defenses cracked. His vision blurred. His chest heaved with a sob he didn't have time to hide. Claire looked up at him briefly. Their eyes met, and in that glance Arthur saw something he had long forgotten. Strength without armor, kindness without condition. She didn't bow to him, didn't flinch at his power. She looked at him as a father, not a billionaire, and in her gaze was a message. You are not failing. He is not broken. You are both human, and that is enough. The maitre d' stood stiff at the edge of the room, his mouth opening, closing, then opening again. But no words came. He had no script for this. None of them did. The power had shifted entirely. Not to Arthur, not to the wealthy guests, but to the waitress on her knees, and the boy holding a chipped wooden bird. Time seemed suspended. Every patron who had muttered insults now stared in silence, some with shame, others with awe. The pearl-necklaced woman dropped her gaze to her lap. The businessman cleared his throat awkwardly, as though the weight of his cruelty had become too heavy. For once, no one dared to complain. No one dared to speak. Ethan's breathing steadied further. His small fingers traced the lines of the wooden bird, his lips moving in whispers too faint to hear. He wasn't screaming anymore. The storm had passed, not because it was forced out, but because someone had entered it with him. Arthur reached forward, his hand trembling, and brushed a strand of hair from his son's damp forehead. "You're okay, Ethan," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You're okay, buddy." Claire rose slowly, her knees aching from the marble floor, but she didn't mind. She adjusted her apron, dusted her palms softly against her thighs, and stood with quiet dignity. She hadn't done it for recognition. She hadn't done it for praise. She had done it because it was right, because no one else had. But in that room, her act was louder than any scream. Arthur pushed back his chair and stood, his hand still resting protectively on Ethan's shoulder. He looked at Claire, his lips parting as though to speak, but words failed him. All he could manage was a nod, deep and trembling, a gesture that carried more gratitude than any eloquence could. And for the first time that night, the room was truly silent. Not tense, not hostile, but reverent. Every guest who had demanded order now sat with the weight of their own reflection. Every glare that had pierced Arthur and his son now softened into something else. Recognition, maybe even shame. The unthinkable had happened. Not chaos, not disgrace, but compassion in its purest form had entered a room that had forgotten what compassion looked like, and it had changed everything. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the silence that followed. It was not the brittle silence of discomfort anymore. It was heavier, fuller, as though the room itself was reflecting on what had just unfolded. The chandeliers still glowed, the plates still gleamed, but something fundamental had shifted. Every diner who had once muttered insults now sat quietly, their silver forks untouched, their wine forgotten. For the first time all evening, the wealth in the room felt small, dwarfed by something far greater. Ethan sat with the little wooden bird clutched in his palm. His breaths came slow and steady now, his body relaxed in a way Arthur rarely saw in public. His eyes, still red from tears, were focused, tracing every line and curve of the tiny carving. It was as though the world had narrowed down to that one safe thing, and in that narrowing he had found peace. Arthur exhaled, his shoulders dropping under the weight he had carried alone for far too long. He looked at his son, then at the waitress who had made this moment possible. Gratitude burned in his chest, raw and overwhelming. He had spent his life buying solutions, paying experts, surrounding himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear. Yet here in this restaurant of chandeliers and judgment, it was a woman in a fraying uniform, carrying scars no one saw, who had given him and his boy what money never could, understanding. He rose slowly, placing a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder. The room's eyes followed him, waiting, wondering if the billionaire would demand something, if he would lash out or retreat. Instead, Arthur turned to Claire. His lips parted, but for a moment no words came. How could they? Gratitude this deep refused to be packaged neatly into language. Finally, his voice broke through, rough and trembling. Thank you, just 2 words. Simple, almost fragile, yet they carried the weight of a lifetime. Arthur Langston, a man who had signed contracts worth billions, had never meant words more deeply than he meant those 2. Claire's expression softened. She shook her head gently, almost embarrassed by the gravity of his gratitude. "You don't need to thank me," she whispered. "I just saw him. Not judged him, not dismissed him, saw him. That was all Ethan had ever needed. That was all Arthur had ever prayed the world would do. The maitre d' lingered awkwardly, as though debating whether to apologize or bow, but the moment left no room for shallow gestures. The other diners lowered their gazes, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others stealing guilty glances at the boy who was no longer screaming, but simply existing, peacefully, beautifully as himself. It was Claire who finally broke the stillness. She bent once more, meeting Ethan's gaze with the same gentleness as before. "You can keep it," she said softly, nodding toward the wooden bird. "It's yours now." Arthur's eyes widened, stunned by the gift. He knew what it meant. It was more than a trinket. It was a piece of her, something she carried to survive her own storms. Yet she gave it freely, as though she understood that Ethan needed it more. Ethan's fingers tightened around the bird, his lips forming a small, tentative smile. It was faint, fleeting, but real. And for Arthur, it was everything. As Claire straightened, the narrator's voice would remind us, sometimes the richest man in the room is not the one with money, but the one with a heart willing to see. Tonight, it was not Arthur Langston's empire that mattered, nor the jewels and watches that glittered on strangers' wrists. It was a waitress on tired feet, with a gift of compassion that no wealth could rival. Arthur guided Ethan gently toward the exit, the boy still holding the bird. As they walked, no one dared to stop them. No one whispered insults anymore. Instead, silence parted before them like a path of respect, long overdue. The pianist, uncertain but moved, pressed a soft key, a note that lingered like a benediction. At the door, Arthur paused and turned back. His eyes found Claire once more. He wanted to promise her the world, to offer her wealth, opportunity, whatever she could ever want. But he understood. This was not about transactions. This was not about debt. This was about humanity. All he could do was carry her act with him, etched forever into the heart of a man who thought he had seen everything. Claire, meanwhile, returned to her duties quietly, wiping down a table as though the world hadn't just shifted. She did not crave applause. She did not seek reward. She had done what she always did, endure, survive, and when no one else dared see. And so the night ended not with a clink of champagne glasses or the rustle of dollar bills, but with the unspoken reminder that dignity belongs to all, compassion costs nothing, and sometimes the smallest acts carry the greatest weight. Because in that room, filled with money and power, it was not wealth that commanded reverence. It was courage. It was kindness. It was a waitress who knelt before a screaming child and gave him peace. That is the truth worth remembering.